one of my favorite TV shows has to be Bar Rescue. Now, I personally think John Taffer is amazing, despite the anger that he often has to display on his first night in a bar just to get through to the owner. To me, it's like operations theater. And as he often says in the show, there is a proven science to running a bar or restaurant that scales. What is your food cost, your profit margin on mixed drinks versus bottled beer versus beer on tap? If you can't answer those questions, you aren't really managing your business, nor can you expect it to be successful. Now, not only are all of those numbers benchmarkable and knowable, they can be compared with external data like median income for the area. And that helps restaurant owners and bar managers with guidance for growing their business. I happen to think there is a lot of crossover ideas between running a restaurant or a bar and being in procurement or supply chain. They're both operational and highly process driven businesses. You have to know your input costs and other people's price setting ability. You have to know what is most profitable that you offer and how to market that in an appealing way to your target customer. But operationally, that is where the real secrets lie. The systems behind a successful restaurant are sophisticated and critical. They can literally make or break a place. And while all of this technical detail is being mastered, there's also the visitor or guest experience, something else we all have to be concerned with, even in a corporate setting. As many times as I watch Bar Rescue, I continue to be fascinated and inspired with crossover ideas. At the same time, here's the sad part. I've done some research on the rescued locations, and with a very few exceptions, they all fail, even with John Taffer's help and the publicity brought by the TV show. Which makes me wonder, being cost effective, operationally sound, and customer friendly, is that really possible? Now, when my Uncle Bob, who happens to listen to the show, so hi, Bob, recommended that I read a book called Unreasonable Hospitality: The Remarkable Power of Giving People More Than They Expect by Will Guidara. If you're with me on YouTube, I actually have the book right here. It's fantastic. I ordered it immediately. This book covers the kind of expertise that John Taffer shares in Bar Rescue, but in a setting where a restaurant isn't on the brink of failure and trying to stay open. They're on the journey from good to great. And so, in this episode of Art of Supply, I'm going to share some of my takeaways from the book Unreasonable Hospitality. We'll connect them to some of the challenges and opportunities that procurement and supply chain leaders face today. Now, let me give you sort of like the basic background. At a high level, Unreasonable Hospitality tells the story of the rise of 11 Madison Park. This is an upscale restaurant based in New York City. But the book isn't really about the restaurant. That just happens to be the setting. It's about vision, systems, customer experience, and management successes and failures. The highlights from a business perspective include a New York Times 4-star rating, 3 Michelin stars, and finally a ranking as the best restaurant in the world in 2017. Now, it is that number one ranking and the team's pursuit of it that really drives all of the rest of the lessons shared in the book. The book opens in 2010. Will Guidara, the author of the book, and his chef and business partner, Daniel Hum, are attending the award ceremony for the 50 best restaurants in the world for the very first time. They were hugely excited to be nominated, and then they came in dead last. Now, still, being 50 in the world is amazing, but they had hoped to place higher. Despite their disappointment, they walked away that night with a vision that they would take first place, a journey that would end up taking them 7 years to complete. After they left the ceremony that night, they wrote, "We will be number one in the world," on a napkin. And that became their rallying cry. Now, one of the differences that you find out very quickly in this book is that, yes, 11 Madison Park is a restaurant. And so there has to be a lot of focus on the food. Most restaurants at that level, that's where they place the focus. But what makes 11 Madison Park different is that they also focus on the dining room service and the operations that go along with it. To my earlier comment about operations and systems, that's where I really started to see some of the transferable lessons from the restaurant and hospitality management industry to procurement and supply chain. Systems are absolutely critical. And at 11 Madison Park, they had processes and systems for everything, not just so that they could stay consistent, but so that they could refine and tweak and make them better. So, for instance, one of the things that they did was that they used hand signals, kind of like you'd see in a baseball game, so that staff could communicate across the dining room without disturbing guests. All of these systems did keep things consistent, made everybody's role clear, but it made it easier to onboard new team members, for instance. They would look at the dinner experience. Where did it feel like it was taking too much time? Or how could you put down a check without making the guests feel rushed after what was admittedly a very expensive dinner? The book actually includes a chapter on Will Guidara's experience in a corporate setting before he gets to 11 Madison Park. He works as an assistant purchaser and controller for Restaurant Associates, which is now part of Compass Group. Now, I like to think that means he worked in procurement for a while. That critical experience taught him to manage all of the costs associated with running a restaurant, as well as how to do so without affecting the customer experience. It also gave him the intellectual basis for what would later become his 95-5 rule. While he was managing a restaurant at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, also before 11 Madison Park, he had the opportunity to put a gelato cart out in the sculpture garden and run it sort of like a mini restaurant. He was always keeping an eye on the guest experience. And so he had picked out these little blue spoons that were made in Italy for guests to eat their gelato with. Guidara describes them as preposterously, heartbreakingly expensive. I can only imagine. And yet he felt that he had to have them. Now, this is where the rule of 95-5 comes in. By efficiently and ruthlessly managing 95% of his costs, he created a 5% slush fund that he could use for discretionary spending. And that is what he used to buy the spoons. Those spoons went to the guest experience. And as he writes in the book, quote, because that last 5% has an outsized impact on the guest experience, it is some of the smartest money you'll ever spend. Now, this idea of 95-5 feels like it could be a conversation starter that would prove very useful in conversations with internal stakeholders that are less thrilled about the idea of saving, but would be very enthusiastic about creating a 5% that they can spend almost foolishly, but with purpose. I'm thinking about marketing here in particular. It might even help how they feel about the rest of their work with procurement if they understand that by managing most of the spend very carefully, you're creating this sort of 5% concept for the whole business, which can ultimately lead to corporate growth. Now, as the title of the book would suggest, the real key to 11 Madison Park's success and all of the teachings in this book is the concept of unreasonable hospitality. So, what's unreasonable hospitality? One of the examples shared early on is one night there's a diner in the restaurant, and a staff member realizes that the customer keeps getting up and leaving. And they ask him, is there anything we can help with? And he explains that his car is parked at a meter and he keeps having to run out and put in more quarters. I think this is before you would actually do the parking on your phone. So the staff took over responsibility for feeding that guest's meter for the rest of the dinner so he could enjoy his meal. Now, that was sort of an accidental opportunity. Over time, it becomes very deliberately done, where the whole staff is trained to look for these opportunities. Now, I would say over time, the idea of unreasonable hospitality actually reaches the point of being excessive. And at some point, Guidara has to figure out how to balance this idea of going above and beyond with ensuring that the experience is relaxed and that his staff is having simple and genuine interactions with the guests. Now, this is also admittedly a really hard thing to do. Very few of us have the time or the energy or, frankly, the creativity to go above and beyond regularly. And I will say it's not something that the typical corporate culture incentivizes. The other way of looking at that is that there's absolutely nothing preventing any of us from doing it at any time. And it all starts with those systems and the 95/5. So just like you can create 5% of spend to be purposefully frivolous with, you can also run your systems to manage 95% of the work that has to get done very efficiently so that the 5% of resource capacity or energy or time becomes, again, sort of like an energy slush fund. Now, that could translate, as it did in Will's case, into those extravagant blue spoons. Or in a corporate setting, it could be creating the time to sit down and brainstorm with a stakeholder or brainstorm with a supplier about what the business could be doing better. Going above and beyond isn't just about tips. Remember, this is all in pursuit of becoming number one in the world. This is pursuit of excellence. And as Guidara writes in the book, excellence is the culmination of thousands of details executed perfectly. Now, he does understand that mistakes will happen, and he does talk about how to handle them when they do, being very, very careful to correct people in the right way. He also focuses on this idea of the last inch, which is a little bit like the final mile of the supply chain. He actually talks about how much work goes into, finishing the dining room and having a perfect wine service and the thought that goes into testing recipes and cooking a meal. If you're the member of the staff that's putting that plate on the table and you sort of fumble it at the last moment or put it down too hard and it shifts the presentation of the food, all of the work that happened prior to that has been somewhat wasted. And you're not just affecting the guest's experience, you are letting down the entire team whose work led up to that moment. He notes that it's worth slowing down. I love this idea. This is something I say all the time. Slow is smooth, and smooth is fast. Slow down and make sure that the important moments go right. And whether that means putting a plate down gently or reviewing a presentation just one more time before sharing it, that moment right before contact with your end customer, whoever that happens to be, is absolutely critical. And it should be done in a way that respects all of the time and effort that led up to it. I even think this idea of excellence, let alone pursuit of it, deserves more thought. If we're going to talk about procurement and supply chain excellence, there are a few things we have to be honest with ourselves about. Excellence isn't just hard, it is uncomfortable. And honestly, most people won't have what it takes long term. Gadara shares a quote in the book from President Calvin Coolidge. I guess this was on a plaque that hung on his bedroom wall as a kid. And it read, quote, "Nothing in this world can take the place of persistence. Talent will not. There is nothing more common than unsuccessful men with talent. Genius will not. Unrewarded genius is almost a proverb. Education will not. The world is full of educated derelicts. Persistence and determination alone are omnipotent." So, this idea that you have to have great systems and great personalities in your staff, that you have to keep an eye on the details while also keeping an eye on the big picture every day, all day, year in and year out. Now, ironically, Gadara and his team were so dedicated to this pursuit of excellence. At one point, they realized they had pushed the team too far. A staff member actually came running in a panic into the kitchen, thinking that she was 2 hours late for her shift when she was actually half a day early. And they saw that as a red flag that stress had started to set in a way that was unhealthy. Now, because they had recognized it, they stopped and made a change. They chose to slow down and get everything right instead of spinning up. Now, this idea of, pursuing excellence no matter how difficult it is, but also keeping an eye on the stress, I think is a nod to the fact that the restaurant business, frankly, like every other business, is incredibly people centric. Managing the staff is therefore critical to the restaurant's rise to that number one spot. Now, some of the advice in the book you would absolutely expect. It's very typical advice. Empower your people to step up and communicate to them regularly that you expect them to do so. Recognize exceptional work and showcase deserving people as far up the chain as you can get the message. Promote from within whenever possible and allow people to bring their personal best to every effort. But the really amazing accomplishment that he had was getting everyone to buy into the effort associated with his vision. So he had to have the vision and articulate it, holding himself to the same high standard he wanted everyone else to follow. But his team had to do the same. Yes, he had to design the systems and make sure everybody knew what they were, but he also needed to bring everybody with him, winning over sort of hearts and minds to both the vision and also the way that they were going to get there. Being detail oriented ends up sounding like a superpower for Guidara in this business, but it wasn't enough for him to be detail oriented. He had to train others to be the same way or, hire people who are similarly detail oriented. Because otherwise, he would have spent all of his time nagging and replacing staff that turned over. When I think about the team as he describes them in the book, one of the things he doesn't say, but that I notice, is that there is simply no room for apathy on a team that aspires to excellence. Hiring is a very hard thing to do at all, let alone do well. And believe me, I get it. Sometimes we just need bums and seats, as Philip Eidson likes to say. But that is not the way to achieve excellence. It truly is an all or nothing pursuit, even if you don't get it right every time. Every single person, from dishwasher to dinner runner to hostess to the people taking reservations to every single member of the kitchen and operational staff, no one can be just doing a job. They have to be wholly bought into and committed to the vision. Now, while Guidara and the team at 11 Madison Park enjoyed a ton of success, they also faced plenty of adversity examples and failures along the way. For instance, in 2008, they had to pivot to handle the effects of the recession. That was something that hit them particularly hard, given how expensive it was to eat at that restaurant and the effect of overall business cutbacks in New York City. During that time, I'm proud to say, Guidara leaned back on his time in procurement. He cut everywhere he could, always looking to make sure that those cuts did not affect the customers. Now, this meant doing things that, in a way, might have struck at the restaurant's pride. For instance, he talked about switching away from those formal tall chef hats to something a little bit simpler. Those chefs had to sort of hold their chins high and not allow it to affect their pride because those hats were just so much more expensive. The restaurant also started offering affordable lunches, and everybody was a little bit affected by this. He kept them focused on the fact that their task was to keep the restaurant open. But it had an unexpected positive side effect. Those less expensive lunches brought them into contact with younger diners who would end up becoming some of their most loyal regulars over time when things went back to usual. I'm sure all of this was hard for the team, and it required a lot of determination as well as creativity. At one point, Guidara writes about a lavish Kentucky Derby party that they threw, and it was a huge success at a time when everyone, guests and staff alike, needed something different to go well. The morale boost associated with that was absolutely amazing. Now, in addition to dealing with economic challenges, 11 Madison Park did receive bad reviews over the years. When those bad reviews ran in the paper for everyone to see and read, including the staff, of course, that was painful. Even though they had earned those less than ideal reviews, they had to force themselves to deal with what they said. And the way I read it, Managing those reviews and the human emotions that went with them was key to Guidara's success as a manager and as a restaurant operator. So, management wise, he allowed the team to experience the natural emotional progression, right? You sort of go from anger to frustration to disappointment to acceptance. You go through that. He went through the same journey and he was honest and transparent with them about what he was feeling. From an operator standpoint, though, it meant that he had to take the criticism and turn it into something positive, being honest with himself rather than defensive, and recognizing when changes needed to be made or coming up with solutions for problems they didn't realize they had. Some of the best operational advice in this book can apply in absolutely any line of work. So, for instance, and this is definitely the strongest example from the book, anything that happens all the time should be systematized. Now, that could be anything from checking customers in for reservations to problems that seem to happen regularly. If there is anything that happens all the time, that's a system and you need to solve for it. So, for instance, if procurement finds that stakeholders are regularly getting frustrated at the same point in the sourcing process, or if packages in the supply chain are regularly getting stuck or delayed at the same point on their way to a customer, you have to find a way to solve for that at scale. Now, maybe it's a different kind of meeting with stakeholders, or a different channel for managing those packages, or even just a different way of summarizing information. But you have to figure out how to address those. And the first step to addressing them is knowing that they're happening. The only way that any team or business is going to identify those common problems and come up with good solutions for them is to talk about the problems they're seeing as a team. Most procurement teams are so focused on carrying out their processes that they're not spending quite enough time sitting down as a group to talk about how those processes work. Now, I do suspect that having AI and some of the workflow and orchestration tools that we now have is forcing us to spend more time and energy thinking about our processes. And as we do that, hopefully we start to solve for the trouble spots as much as we do the opportunity of getting them better. Now, going along with this, whether it's in a system or whether it's just simply something that you do, documenting everything is essential. That means processes, systems, customer preferences, birthdays, data points. I know this work is hard. There is absolutely no spare time set aside for doing it. But if a restaurant in New York City can pull it off, the rest of us don't really have an excuse. I also think the idea of keeping apathy out of your operation, having clear, consistent standards that apply fairly to everyone, is an important thing to think about if you aspire to excellence. If you allow anybody on the team to lag behind the pack, the more exceptional team members are going to notice and resent it. And over time, they will drop their own standards. The other thing is, you never know when someone who maybe isn't on the top of their game is actually handling your most important customer. That could be having unexpected contact with the CFO, or it could be an unidentified restaurant critic who happens to come in. You want to know that no matter who someone on your team is dealing with, they are going to do their very best and move the whole team towards the fulfillment of that vision. Now, I highly recommend getting a copy of Unreasonable Hospitality and reading it. But I will tell you, without spoiler alerts on the book itself, that the ending is not exactly what I had expected. Now, ironically, this made me respect the journey they had been on even more. This next piece is not actually included in the book. It's simply what happened in real life. I started this episode by talking about bar rescue and how nearly all of those rescued bars fail. Sadly, the same seems to be true of 11 Madison Park. The time came when Will Guidara made the decision that he and his business partner, Chef Danny Hum, should part ways. Will left the partnership, ironically, just 1 year before the COVID pandemic made the restaurant business harder than anyone could have imagined was possible. Like other restaurants, 11 Madison Park struggled during the pandemic, although they did manage to defy the odds and reopen in June of 2021. Unfortunately, according to Wikipedia, they have since been plagued by high staff turnover because they no longer allow tipping, and the menu is strictly plant based, which definitely is going to limit your clientele. So they're still open, but unfortunately, it doesn't sound like they're performing at the same level that they were when this book was written. And perhaps that's the biggest lesson of all. Vision, systems, customer experience, and team management all have to come together seamlessly under the right leader for an operation to be successful. Otherwise, it doesn't matter whether you are a dive bar in the Midwest or a storied number one restaurant in the world located in the Flatiron District, you aren't going to be able to maintain that success for long.